Welcome to Varn Vlog and our annual visit from Nightmare Masterclasses. Dave begins today. We're talking about a topic that neither one of us are actually truly qualified to talk about, but have a lot of opinions about.
Same.
Which is the rise of artificial intelligence, are what I really think of as machine learning.
Yep.
And
I've heard you say intelligence is kind of a misnomer.
Right. Well, one is intelligence in humans is actually, and in mammals in general, is actually a fuzzier concept than we like to realize. And that's not even dealing with consciousness problems. One of my friends, who's a cybernetic theorist, and I went at it recently. I mean, we're generally on the same page, but about the idea that the servomotor effect would lead to and recursion would lead to consciousness. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think those behavioristic assumptions actually are true in humans either. And I definitely don't think they're in, like, machine learning is analogous to that. But I do think we have to start talking about the idea and the demarcation of intelligence and consciousness. And one, Marxists historically just avoid the fucking question. The way they use consciousness is like completely different than the way everybody else uses it.
I think that's actually a good instinct.
Yeah. And two, well, it does lead to a problem I've been harping on now for 10 years, which is Marxism has a theory of action, but it is absent an actual theory of mind, because it just assumed that was obvious. Like, and by that I mean, like, Marx assumed that material consciousness in human beings was what's sui generis to humans, from what I can tell from his writing. Although the other,
just taking it as a given.
Yeah. And that labor informs that, but there is something called a species being, and it emerges from the natural material world. And that, you know, and we're just gonna accept that and move on. And there's and your meaning is dependent on your social relationships. Your social relationships emerge out of social reproduction and the reproduction of society as a whole. So your labor is somewhat definitional to your consciousness, but not in like a purely standpoint way. But Marx basically says trying to figure out what species being is unmediated by society is probably not even possible, because humans exist as part of their species being as social. So
we're social animals. It's an incoherent question.
Right. So, like, it's basically a non-question. Bring in, however, a theory of mind, which I think more or less Marx thinks that the reasons behind the Hegelian theory of mind are wrong, but like self-differentiation and conflict and emergence with others, and then the relational definitions that emerge from that as how selfhood forms. There you go. Marxists in general, though, I've never really found that super satisfying. So you see them reaching for, I mean, classically they reach for Freudianism. And I think the reason why they still reach for Freudianism is, frankly, European intellectual habit. I find Freudianism interesting. I find it as an interesting, thick description, but I also think like a whole lot of the assumptions of Freudianism and explanatory myths and whatever are just made up. Like,
if you take the premise that going off of Lacan, that the unconscious is structured like a language, that might have some interesting implications,
right,
with respect to large language models.
So that's actually an interesting debate, because I don't think the unconscious is structured like a language.
I don't even really know if that is what's the phrase? You're not even wrong.
Yeah, it's I don't think it's, because if you take like the strict like say mid-century view, you end up in like sapphire whorfism, which languages are sui generously the structure of consciousness. So like consciousness is literally culturally encoded because culture is language encoded. Um, the thing is that just assumes that the expression of conscious thought as we experience it is the same as conscious thought, which sounds like a weird objection, but it's not one when you think about it very deeply, because you're like, oh yeah, clearly what we are calling consciousness is not just the recursion of language. That's just the only way we can express it, even to ourselves, except when we sometimes think in images.
I do think if you start adding on to that definition with various qualifiers, you run into trouble because you end up making the same sort of ableist arguments that if you start adding to the definition of consciousness by all these special abilities that humans seem to have, of course you're leaving out people who don't have those abilities, right?
And you're also having to deal with the fact that a lot of those abilities actually seem to be present in mammals, depending on which ones you're talking about.
Yeah.
And some of them even in birds, like self-recognition is possible, and like a magpie recognizes themselves in a way that we don't have evidence say a dog does.
Right. Crows are really smart.
So yeah, I mean, so you have two problems. One is the sentience problem, and the other is the awareness problem, just like going off the basic definition of consciousness. Mm-hmm. But then you have the issue of recursive awareness, which is what like the classical cybernetic definition of consciousness was off of behaviorism, is just a system is conscious if it has recursive elements that can make it conscious, which I think, like, well, with that, then you could argue that like a country is a conscious being, and I don't think that makes any sense. There's no singular sentience to that. Or awareness. There's a multiplicity of awareness there, but you could, like, I don't know that actually congeals in any meaningful way. We don't have a brain of society, right?
What about the inverse of this, like, which would be that sentience is just something we made up to sort of make ourselves think that we're special, and when in reality we are really sophisticated automatons?
Sure, that has no implications whatsoever, though.
It has implications insofar as we don't need to even really get into this sentience issue when we're talking about artificial intelligence. We could just focus on what its effects are going to be. Because I feel like a lot of the discussion that I've seen has this inflection where we're almost like fetishizing the idea or the concept of humans. When and it's on both sides of the debate. It's on the skeptic side, because they try to say, well, it can't do this, it can't do that, it's not sentient,
which is the Chinese box argument, right? Like, and the Chinese box argument, you know, that this argument, because one of the problems that you have with leftists on this issue is, like, they ceded all this ground outside of Freudianism completely to analytic philosophy, and they don't read analytic. I mean, most leftists do not read analytic philosophy, so it's like it becomes they don't know.
It's not worth reading.
Well, I actually agree with you, although I would actually argue much of the stuff that we read on the left is not worth reading either. Most of it's sophistry, to be completely honest. It always seems to me like when you deal with analytic versus continental philosophy, you're dealing with rich descriptive bullshit versus rigorously analyzed nothing. So, but I do think here there's actually some interesting things that we could bring into account. So if you for example, take Derick Parfit's view, and Parfit's not a leftist at all.
You're talking about Parfit on Twitter today.
Yeah, I think about Parfit a lot. I thought about Parfit a lot since I was in undergrad in like 1999 in my first philosophy class, and I encountered an essay from his book, Reasons and Persons, I think. What's it called? Actually, I'm going to make sure I get that right. I don't want to lead people on a wild goose chase for a book that doesn't exist.
I'm not really familiar with his work.
Reasons and Persons, and then Persons and Motivations. But the article I remember is actually an article that you can still find free online. It's from 1971, and it's called Personal Identity. And what it goes through and does, and I actually might do a show just in this article, is actually illustrates that there's not a lower level criterion of selfhood that is consistent enough for you to say that sentience and self are the same, and self-formation has any sort of consistent definition between people. Like, you can take a Wittgensteinian view of this, like that there's a bunch of resemblances that we can call a self. He doesn't talk about that, but if you try to set up any strict criterion of meaning for what selfhood is, they fall apart pretty quickly. And he just walks through the ways they fall apart. Which gets to your point, like, it's not really okay. The reason why Marxists might care if it's both sentient and aware is actually interesting, and it has to do when something moves from being fixed capital to variable capital.
Because then it can do human labor.
Right. Then it does human labor, and then it is effectively, from the standpoint of labor, a human.
So I would argue if it can do human labor, then it can do human labor. You know, like we don't need we don't need to even get into that. We just need to look at what its abilities are.
Well, I guess the question is, from the Marxist perspective, agency is actually important here because agency is why you can exploit people, believe it or not. Like, because people have agency, whatever we mean by that. And I'm not going to get into the autonomous. I'm a compatibilist. Like, I don't think.
Me too.
You know, like, I think we can talk about agency. I don't think we can talk about counter-causal free will. That doesn't make any sense. But I do think choices are meaningful. But I also think they're probabilistic. Now, I was just reading an essay by Heil Draper that actually gets into like why Marxists have like not accepted probability, because they basically have a Newtonian model of the universe.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Which was interesting because that was in the inevitability of socialism debate. And then you realize everybody has dropped that, because if they are right about the inevitability of socialism and they had a timestamp on it, they were wrong. And so, but anyway, bring it back to Parfit. I think Parfit, if we take Parfit's criteria here, like, and I'll link this essay in the show notes, of selfhood, not of sentience and awareness. Okay, like we care about selves, and that's why we care about sentience and awareness, because we see sentience awareness is why we have selfhood. What Parfit says is just that's not sufficient, and you can't prove it. Like you can only prove it for yourself. And he actually goes so far to say is you can only, and John Gray says this too, you can't even prove that you think. You can only prove that you are aware that you think. Which is like, oh shit. You know, because at first that seems ridiculous, and you think, then you're like, wait, if I'm an autonoma and this is just recursion, then consciousness is the recursive mechanism, whatever that is. Which, again, I don't know that I believe this, but this is the argument. Then it really doesn't. Then I really don't know that I'm actually thinking. I may just be acting, and the narrative is imposed by the recursive mechanism after the fact. I mean, that's the huge debate in neurology right now, is whether or not consciousness is outside of neurological transmitters, or if it's ad hoc afterwards. And it's a remarkably hard question to answer. Like, in so much that so far we can't answer it. We don't know how we'd even begin to. Which, you know, so one of the things about this, I guess this machine learning question is, yeah, my argument to you is like, it does human labor in some ways, but at the current point, it's not, we can't make it, like, it runs at the process in which it runs, and so it's just going to reduce socially necessary labor time. There's no way to push it to do more without increasing its energy inputs by like running it ragged.
So material constraints are where you have a point.
Right.
The only thing I would say to that is everything I've been reading lately, it's almost as though like on a week by week basis, things are changing. So it's hard to even generalize, but training is getting cheaper. The possibility of being able to run these models locally on your own machine with a relatively low computational requirement seems like it's on the horizon. If not already, it's being toyed around with people who are.
And this isn't offsetting it by having it run on your machine by connecting to a cloud, which is how like we hide the actual energy cost of the internet, for example.
Bingo. Yeah. So, but even OpenAI's GPT API is trivially cheap at this point, and I'm wondering if they are simply just trying to have that be a loss leader for whatever their business model is, or if they can actually afford to keep that API at such a low cost, because as it stands right now, it is trivially cheap.
Well, let's talk about this though. Just as you and me, mano y mano. We all know that right now, anything technological has only artificial scarcity because it has only artificial labor inputs. What do I mean by that? Most of shit replicates itself. Like, it is truly beyond scarcity, other than the scarcity of power and material inputs into that power, which are not insignificant, I may add. I mean, when you're running the internet, but if you can get this like fairly cheap, what I find interesting about this is from the standpoint of like evolution, Dave, we've actually done something that nature couldn't do. Our intelligence is not trivially cheap. Our intelligence requires a shit ton of calories. It requires us to evolve in a way that
you should have seen what I ate for dinner.
Right. It requires us to evolve in a way that makes our birthing more dangerous than it is for most mammals. It requires us to, yeah, and also most mammals birth basically toddlers. We birth things that are like completely useless for the first 3 years of their life.
Like, I'm still useless.
Right. I mean, yeah. And it shows up to the point, like, arguably, because there's very little memory beyond emotional memory from that young, you can't even talk about babies as being fully conscious.
Nope.
So, you know, that's kind of we basically have to be birthed half-baked to maintain our intelligence. And it doesn't make any fucking sense. I mean, I will say this, when you run like the statistical likelihood for our kind of intelligence evolving naturally, which I'm not saying that we didn't, I'm just pointing this out. It's real. Mammals in general are actually really weird that we happened. Like,
yeah.
It's just,
you can, I mean, part of it is, you know, the comet that killed off the dinosaurs.
Oh yeah, but like, why we evolved the kind of intelligence quotients, and not just humans. I mean, dolphins, elephants, it's not immediately obvious what the survival advantage is. At least if you look at it from the standpoint of even the gene or the individual organism, which is what most
I was going to say, you
models
can't really
assume.
look at it on the basis of the individual.
Well, but that is actually the Darwinistic assumption, is that individual selection. Removing it to the gene was a way to get beyond the whole group versus individual selection problem. But it looks like in humans, actually, you have both group selection and individual selection, both through natural and sexual selection. So
Yeah.
it's really hard to fucking say. Like, and this is already bracking out. There's some of our lefty friends who immediately, once we start talking about genetics, they just check out and think we're racist or something. So like what do you mean genes?
Genetics is environmental conditions that have been encoded into us from the past.
Yeah,
that's the way I look at it.
Well, I mean, yeah. The expression of genes is complicated, and I actually, even the more I learn about epigenetics, I'm even sort of like, we should be careful what we say about that, because we don't really understand the mechanisms yet. We know that there are some, but that some of them are real thin, and some of them are gene triggers. So what I'm saying, though, what makes this machine learning model so interesting is its intelligence is arguably, it's less fuzzy than human intelligence, although it's modeling itself off human intelligence. And in some ways, then it's actually monitoring its power use. I mean, like, if you think about, if it's basically built on human intelligence as it's modeled through the inputs into writing, then it is piggybacking off of all of human energy resources in some ways, like all the.
Oh, totally.
But it means we do have an intelligence sorting mechanism that is energy fairly cheap, because it doesn't have to deal with a body much. Like, we just have to keep a couple machines running, and it's a line of code. Like
it's starting to get freaky.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about that, it's like, so my argument has been that it's just not a human, and it's not going to be it's going to approximate a human intelligence. It's not a human intelligence. I'm not sure that matters, but
yeah.
I think what it does mean is we're not actually going to be able to predict if it starts really being sentient in any sort of meaningful sense, what it's going to do, because it's not really based on our intelligence. It's piggybacking off of it, which is, I guess that sounds strange, but like, our intelligence isn't code. We don't know how to code for human intelligence.
We don't know how to code for it, but that doesn't mean it isn't code.
Well,
right?
Yeah, we don't know, in so much that anything is a code of proteins, sure. But like, what we can say is, for example, computer intelligence has been limited so far by the fact that it's based on Boolean modifiers, which was a misguided mathematical attempt to model human intelligence that has absolutely no actual relationship to the way humans think. It was one of these 19th centuries, the way we think. And so what it means to me is, like, we're black boxing ourselves and having something that didn't evolve the way we do and doesn't really think the way we do, be able to use our intelligence in a way that makes it infinitely smarter than any individual and potentially smarter than us collectively, although not yet. And now, I'm not one of these people who think this is going to be like the singularity. I'm not one of those techno-utopians, but I do think this is an interesting question.
Yeah. And also, on the other end of that are all these billionaires signing a petition saying that we should stop research past GPT-4.
Since we're going so fast, that's the thing. Like, it's changing in the order of weeks now.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would argue that the people who signed that have ulterior motives. Like, I think Elon Musk is just has some kind of grudge against OpenAI.
I
And
mean,
probably
Roscoe's Basculus is how, one of his early things, right? So
yeah. I also think they're concerned about the economic implications because it's going to hit their bottom line if this starts taking some unpredictable turns.
My thing is, if good luck bottling this up. Just like we thought about bottling like genetic research up. Once it's out, I don't know how you do that. Like,
yeah, I mean, you saw that. I don't know if you saw this, but Meta's llama model leaked. There's some speculation that they allowed it to leak, but I don't know. It's going to be exceedingly hard to keep these things closed, and there is a general culture in programming and tech in general to keep things open. So you're already selecting for people who are in favor of just showing everything you got.
Yeah, well, this is the interesting thing about tech right now is while I admit that we can say that the internet's always been commodified and people push back at me about this, I'm like, yeah, but we didn't always buy into its commodification.
It hasn't always been this bad.
But you have power law instituted walled gardens, meaning there's so many people in the walled garden trying to get out of it is nearly impossible. But this is like a power law multiplication. We're only there. We only use Twitter because everybody fucking uses Twitter. We only use Facebook, which is actually still orders of magnitude bigger than Twitter, even though we all complain about how it's dead, and it is hemorrhaging money like crazy. Because of, everybody uses Facebook. That's why these things. That's why it's been so hard to upsell them once one or two platforms stuck. That's why if you want to defeat TikTok, you're likely going to have to ban it, which we also see. I think the U.S. State Department and Instagram have completely different reasons for wanting to ban TikTok, but they're definitely conspiring on that almost.
And
Certainly.
This is it really amuses me when you see these liberals on Twitter just advocating for the regulation of AI. And on one hand, I understand why they feel that way, but it's so naive because any legislation that's going to be passed is going to be I mean, you saw what they tried to do with the Restrict Act,
it's basically like an internet kill switch bill.
Yeah.
Plus a lot of backdoor expansions of Patriot Act shit. I mean, it's a lot of the libertarian reporting on it was based off of the most expansive view of the law, which I think is a questionable assumption, but it's not out of the realm of possibility because everything in that act is going to be settled in court.
Yeah, and if something is explicitly not part of the bill, it should be stated within the bill.
Right.
So I'm inclined to take an open view of it as well, because that's how it's going to be applied.
Right. It's going to be applied expansively and then limited or delimited by the court, which I think people just don't understand how important case law is to all this shit. And one of the things that is weird about it is since it would be hard to know who has standing except when they apply it to U.S. citizens. So the only thing you could say is there's a disincentive in it to declare a U.S. citizen a foreign actor, because that would actually probably immediately trigger a constitutional crisis. But although who knows these days, it feels like we're triggering constitutional crisis every 3 minutes. So maybe I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, and I don't have faith in the Supreme Court to make a ruling that I would agree with.
I don't have faith. So you know what's funny? Actually, I think about it. The only Supreme Court justice I would trust on this issue is a conservative, and that's
Roberts?
Gorsuch.
Oh, Gorsuch.
No, I do not trust Roberts. Gorsuch is a weirdo. But like, if you like read Gorsuch's stuff on like indigenous rights, he's actually good on that. Like, there's weird. He has,
What?
yeah, he is. He's the only. He's actually. He's also one of the people who voted that on foreign standing in a way where the liberals voted with the conservative court. With Kagan and Sotomayor voted with the conservatives, and it was Brown. And who does that leave?
Don't ask me.
Yeah, it was Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, and I believe one liberal. I can't remember which liberal it was. Maybe it wasn't Sotomayor, because there's only 3 liberals on the court now. But right now, you have the weird thing about the court is, just so people kind of get it, if you're actually following this, it's extremely conservative, but you actually can't predict how Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Roberts, and Amy Coney Barrett are actually going to vote on all the issues.
You're saying if it's one of their pet issues that they're actually not conservative about, they might.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. They might. And Amy Coney Barrett's actually a moderate conservative on everything but abortion. Right. So you don't know. Like, we don't know, for example, like on the Supreme Court standing on loan forgiveness.
Right.
We know that Roberts, probably Alito, and Thomas are going to vote against it. We don't really know what Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett are going to do. Like,
I mean, I saw the part where Amy Coney Barrett was asking some pointed questions towards the people trying to mount this lawsuit. So that made me feel like, oh, is she actually gonna vote in favor of loan forgiveness? I hope so. It would help me.
Yeah, I mean, it would help me a little bit. I'm kind of torn on this, since we're being pretty free-running in this conversation, as we always are. We are going to get back to the machines. We're going to try to.
Oh, I'll get back to it. I'm hyper fixated on it, so we will get back to it.
I do think it's interesting how hard this is to fix, because on one hand, it seems pretty clear. Like, the Biden administration said they knew they had the law on their side, but they weren't sure that the Supreme Court was on their side, which to me is like, what are you not saying, Biden? Like, are you not willing to actually take the logically deducible step that you have rogue elements in the Supreme Court? But beyond that, it's a fix, but it's kind of a shitty one. And if they were serious about it, one, we know we're going to have to do something legislatively if they're really serious about it. And two, they would have forgiven the shit immediately and not put all the roadblocks in, because they had a year before this even got rolled out, and they didn't have anything ready when they rolled it out, which was kind of amazing, which tells you that, like, they were just doing law review and being stubborn, more or less. Which also tells me that there's a real sense that Biden didn't really care if it got reversed, because it would be harder to reverse if they immediately just paid out. All right, we're just dropping the 10 grand in everybody's account, and if it wipes it out, good. Have a nice day. Because the administrative cost alone, like, eats up any benefits to means testing it. Like,
yeah, it seems like they're almost expecting it to get reversed, and he can just be like, well, I tried. Elect me again, and I'll do something else.
But that, you see, this is what I'm worried about with the Democrats right now. That seems to be their strategy, is to deliberately fail and then promise if we only won more that we would not fail next time, even though we have no history. And unfortunately, with younger voters who are college educated, it's actually working.
Yeah. I mean, with the results of this midterm,
although I don't know if it's going to maintain working, because for all the things that I disagree with the Dylan Riley, Robert Brenner 7 theses in the New Left Review, which I've talked a lot about because it pisses me off. But one of the things that I do agree with them about is, like, we don't really know what's going to happen in the general, because right now, for the first time, the demographics have shifted where demographic voting patterns are going to favor liberals and left-wingers. And, like, which are separate categories for me, but nonetheless, because they're college educated now. There's less. And college educated people are even more likely than old people to actually vote in midterms.
Yeah.
Whereas in the general, those dynamics are completely different. We don't know. We don't know what they're going to do. So who knows? I have been good at calling elections off of polls and guts for most of my life. I don't feel comfortable calling shit after 2020. Like,
me neither.
Like, I don't feel like I feel like my priors are broken, you know, like no, everything and I say that because I actually do think realignment's been like a 4-generational process. Like, it's not, when people talk about realignment now, I'm like, we've been realigning since the fucking 60s. Like, there's been a push-pull on partisan realignment and decoupling from class relationships that emerged only really between the 1930s and the 1950s anyway, that have been uncoupling since longer than I've been alive, you know, so since before the 80s. And it feels like it's finally happened, but we don't really know what it means. Because what I mean by that is, like, increasingly finance bourgeoisie and the educated are with the Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
The Sunbelt bourgeoisie remains with the Republicans, but like the petty bourgeoisie and like certain degrees of like non-urban workers, they're not with the Republicans, and that historically, even in the 80s, that wasn't really true. Like, Reagan was a one-off for that. They didn't maintain. So there has been like a de-alignment with class. There's some alignment still. The very poor vote for Democrats if they vote. That's a big fucking if. And if you make over $250,000, you vote for Democrats. If you make over $1 million, you probably vote for both. Like, you just
Yep.
you know, like, there's no partisan loyalty there. And if you make between 100,000 and 250,000, which is a vast majority of people who make over 100,000 in that bracket, you vote Republican for the most part, particularly if you're white, but even if you're not. So
I think what it comes down to is, you talked about this a little bit. What it comes down to is neoliberalism over? That's really ultimately what it comes down to.
I feel like it's hard for me to tell if we have moved to something new, or if it's like that period from like the late 60s to the early 80s when you're really transitioning out, and there's still kind of Fordism and with the beginnings of neoliberalism coexisting for a while, and they really kind of continue to coexist until the early 90s. Like, and what do I mean by that? Like, yeah, you had deindustrialization, but it didn't happen overnight. It was a long process. Like my area where I grew up in Georgia wasn't really deindustrialized until the middle of the 90s. And it was never completely deindustrialized, but like,
right.
But
the United States is still an industrial powerhouse.
Yeah, it's the second
countries.
It's the second largest one. The EU collectively sometimes knocks us to third, but hasn't in the last year. And while the EU's economic power is greater than the US if you include all of them, including the UK, which I don't know if you can do anymore. And the UK seems to be dead set on, since the UK only invested in finance capital for like 30 years, now that it's lost its ability to leverage that off of a trade parity with the euro, it's going to be a mid-income country, but it's, you know, that's going to really hurt to transition to that. Like, they're basically going to be like Chile or Argentina or something.
I think that's even optimistic.
Yeah, maybe. Um, and I also pointed this out to people when I was like, Britain by itself, without its empire, is going to have a hard time reindustrializing too, because you industrialize under imperial conditions. You don't have that anymore. You're a fucking island. Like,
Yep.
like, you don't have enough internal consumption to float your own economy, even under MMT conditions.
It's like a little boy dressed up in a big man's suit. That's what the UK is.
Which I don't feel good about. I mean, like, as much as I like to shit on the English, I don't feel good that, like,
no,
that this is
working
happening.
people are going to suffer.
Yeah, a whole lot, which is why there's working class militancy there. But as I've been talking to British leftists more recently, and they're just like, it's too little too late, and the left has not dealt with it well.
Yeah.
Like the left hasn't actually been out with that working class militancy. And then people go, well, why don't we have that in America? I'm like, they're desperate and losing, and they're not winning in this. Similar to like France, like,
right.
Yeah, France is out in the roads, and yes, they took over BlackRock, but Macron's still not budging.
Nothing they've done has worked. So as much as you can shit on the American left, look, yeah, the French are militant. You got to hand it to them. But
it doesn't seem to matter.
Play out the way they want it to? I don't think it does.
It does not seem to matter.
So I've been politically hopeless, which is, if you're psychoanalyzing me, that's probably why I'm fixated on this particular issue.
Well, this is interesting because 14 years ago, actually 15 years ago, this is around the end of the aughts, which I've been told is cringe to say, but fuck you, young people. Everyone under 22 is a kulak. I'm kidding. Not by much. No, I actually like Zoomers because they're moral nihilists, which is not something I would have expected.
Yeah.
I mean, they're prudes, kind of, but in a weird way, because in some ways sexual identity and sexual expression's like ubiquitous, and yet also like it's absolutely not.
Also, like sex scenes in movies aren't cool anymore.
Yeah, there's an interesting notion about physical exploitation there. Thank you. That I think I wrestle with. So, sex scenes in movies aren't cool anymore, yet porn is ubiquitous.
Right.
It's which
that's
I think
why
is
they
like,
think that.
Right, which is why I feel like that's related. It's like not only do you not get titillated by it anymore, there's also you don't imagine there's another reason to have it there, right?
Yep.
Because
it couldn't possibly be like important to the story for some reason.
Yeah, which makes it hard to make fun of Ron DeSantis, in Christian schools in Florida banning David, because even though that's clearly, I'm like, yeah, but again, if you think in modern movies that's the only reason why sex and nudity is there, then you're not really that different on that spectrum, right? Like, that said, Zoomers are nicer to each other than even millennials were, so I want to, even though I also think like most people under 45, like they're used to most of their social interactions being mediated in a way that actually makes normal human relationships even more anxiety producing than they were like 40 years ago, because you're just not used to, and I mean this like literally, you're essentially not used to engaging with all the reading of a person that you normally have to do in person to understand things. There's all these contextual things that just people have kind of not had to deal with because they've been dealing with it through mediated devices.
I could say something right now, which if you saw it just via text, you would interpret it as like me being hostile, but you can tell based on my body language that I'm kidding, or, You miss a lot of that with
Yeah. I mean, I think I come
online
off.
interaction.
I think I come off way more as an asshole on Twitter and Facebook than I do even on this.
Yeah,
Like, although I'm probably more aggressive, like,
right.
but,
But it's
um,
offset by a number of just
yeah, there's a number of things. There's tone, there's body language, there's
context.
context, there's a whole thing, and people, and I don't think this is just young people, but it's compounded in young people. Like the literacy problem is compounded in young people. People talk about how they don't know how to read anymore. I'm like, they get it twice because we all don't read as much now because we have visual media all the time, which we've had since the 1980s. But there was an interesting time period from like 2003 to about as late as 2015, where people were actually reading more than they had historically done since like the 1950s, because so much of the internet was text-based and we were using it to watch less TV.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now that you have I mean, this is where like I'm against them banning TikTok, but part of me isn't. Like, I'm against it for all the right political reasons, and I think it's a terrible idea to censor, and I don't support it, but I do think it's pernicious anyway.
Oh yeah, we shouldn't be confused about that. It's destroying their brains.
It's destroying executive function.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's destroying intelligence, but one thing that we've actually learned when I went through my whole, did you watch the video? I went through literacy stats, and I also talked about media literacy. I'm like, you guys thought that general literacy decline was going to be offset by media literacy? No evidence for that. That people actually are less able to navigate online media than they were 10 years ago. It's like knowing what to trust and how to trust it. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But one of which is a whole lot of shit that used to be free is now behind a paywall. And it's the better quality stuff that is. Like, that's one of the few Nathan Robinson arguments that I was like, oh, that's a good point, Nathan Robinson. I'm going to pretend that you didn't say that in a Mid-Atlantic accent. So that I can take it seriously.
I've been up to lately. I haven't been following him.
I don't know, not a whole lot. He kind of chilled out after the great unionization versus Nepo publisher debate.
Right.
So,
as far as literacy goes, now students are going to have GPT writing all their essays. So that's not a
interestingly
check in favor
so far,
of literacy.
They're not using it yet. In the high school level, and I teach in like an 80% online program, and like we haven't had that problem yet.
How could you tell?
So I'm going to tell you something. ChatGPT writes like a mediocre honor student. My students don't write that well.
Right, but if I was an entrepreneurial high school student, I would figure out ways to do less work without completely just taking it word by word. You know what I mean?
Maybe. I've had kids referencing things that they were never taught, and then when I question them, they don't know it. So that's how you can kind of tell. But in general, I think we're assuming a general understanding about this with young kids who are not even plugged up enough to know how to use these things.
Yeah, not yet.
Not yet. But all of them, by the time we get in college, are going to know, and that's going to be a problem. I think, as I've told kids in my honors kids, I'm like, use ChatGPT to help you. Like, don't copy and paste it, but it's like, it's not any worse than a lot of other things. Like,
don't take what it says. Use it cautiously. Any specific claim,
because it will make shit up.
False.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, it's not as good. Like, that's one of the things with the Bing ChatGPT. It's like occasionally it just makes shit up, but
hallucination.
Right. But if I actually was just like, if they use it as an aphasiac, which is like my like the reason why I don't write a lot of people like, why don't you write your essays in prose? And I'm like, you know how long it takes me to write prose when I'm not in college? Like,
Yeah.
I can do it, but like it takes me months, like, because I have to write it and sit on it for 6 months and then read it again to edit it, or I have to pay someone to edit it. And they need to be someone who is also in enough contact with me that they can call me up to explain what words are missing. And if anyone's ever seen my Twitter, I sound smart till I don't, and that's why. But as an aphasiac, oh my God, it's a godsend.
Yeah.
I can just be like, here's my stuff, make it read right. Like, and then I go, okay, well, that word is not what I meant, but now I see that it changed that. And so even if it's wrong, I can still fill it in. Like, it's a godsend of automation. And I think it's going to cut off a lot of low-end writing jobs. It's going to cut off a lot of low-end coding jobs. I actually don't see it yet cutting off a lot of high-end ones. And frankly, we don't have enough fucking labor anyway. So
that's what I was going to say. I think the only reason, not to get too conspiratorial, but the only reason this is really being allowed to happen now is because there is a labor shortage, and you can force these white collar workers into the proletarian proper,
right, to do semi-specialized physical labor later that like they won't probably be total grunts, but and by the way, so far these tech layoffs have just been absorbed. Like, we don't, like, there's been massive tech layoffs even before ChatGPT, and they have not affected the overall employment rate.
Yeah, what, it's like 3.5 right now. It
Yeah.
just came out.
Yeah, I mean, like, so when people lose their tech jobs, they're finding other tech jobs, or they're going into like lower middle management somewhere. Like, I mean, it's pretty clear that the current trend of decoupling and pulling back and shutting down borders is really putting strains on things. And I think it puts strains on things that makes both political parties uncomfortable, because it makes the conservatives who, I mean, also, by the way, let's be honest, it was Reagan who started the liberalization of the immigration code. Like,
yeah.
So it was
actually the debates.
Yeah, it was the conservatives who started it anyway. But the reason why they did that, if we are honest, is we had this whole fucking infrastructure that was built from the baby boom. We didn't want it to collapse, and we needed people, and so we got them.
Like, you need low wage workers.
Well, we needed everything. We also needed highly skilled workers because we couldn't train enough of them ourselves.
Yeah, and then you get the H-1B.
Right, which is, also how you have situations of like people of color who are statistically, as an aggregate, wealthier than white people, but other people of color who are even like the same, or like the same overall broad race, like Cambodians and Vietnamese versus like South Koreans or something. I think that's one of our South Asians in particular, which is particularly interesting when you think about how poor South Asia is, right? Or like Nigerians are one of the richest demographics, but it's because our laws are so racist. Only the very rich and the most skilled can come in anyway. That's a point just to say, like, we had on both ends of the skill structure, we handled the decline of the baby boom by immigration. That's how we handled it. Now that that's kind of over, and we're looking at global decoupling, they have not, even though Fareed Zakaria might go on CNN and whine about it, and even be open that he's whining about the loss of cheap labor, we are not willing to open the borders back up in any significant sense to unskilled labor. And we're even getting questionable about it with skilled labor. And that has not changed from Trump to Biden.
Was he the one making the claim that it was contributing to inflation?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I agree with that.
It's a small contributor to inflation, but it is one. one of the things I've been trying to tell people is like, well, people have been like, why are they trying to do this thing that seems contradictory? And I do think it risks collapsing the entire world economy in ways that my friend Nico Villarreal, I think, has only recently warmed up to the real like possibility of. Because I'm always I'm not a final crisis guy. I keep on pushing on people. Like we predicted the final crisis way too many times. We don't know what's going to happen in super
But this
austerity.
time,
Right. But where I will say I am worried is like we're seeing subprime fracturing in the UK because while we mostly got rid of it in the US, we didn't really get those same kinds of fixed mortgages with slightly higher interest rates passed as policy in Europe and Canada and Australia. So even fixed rates still variable. It gets reassessed often, and people's housing rates are going all over the place. Plus, in the United States, we're having commercial real estate crash. Plus,
I was gonna say,
it looks like it might be getting so expensive to service between inflation and the interest rate housing loans are becoming unviable without subprime.
without subprime. That just came out today, right? That they're losing money on mortgages.
Yeah.
I go back and forth on this.
I think it's big. I just don't know that it's final. Like,
right.
So, I mean, the only thing that's good for is renters. Renters are finally going to get a break, but they're not getting a lot of one yet. Like,
I hardly pay anything for rents, so I'm in a good spot. I just got informed that they are increasing my rent next year by like $40.
No,
I'll take it.
I got a $50 increase in rent, but I actually rent from an individual who like rents under market, and I'm in the West, which is ridiculously expensive. Like the closer you are to California, the farther from God.
Even Utah.
You might say. Oh yeah. Utah is one of the hardest housing markets in the country till very recently. But they one of the things that they threw up a ton of rental property, and then the interest rate went up. So there has been significant negative pressure. The other issue is we have stalled it off for maybe a year or two, but we're running out of water. We just got a ton of snow, so we might be okay for a few more years, but there might be an arsenic cloud over the valley before too long. I'm actually not joking.
I don't love that. I don't love hearing that.
So, one of the things that I find it interesting how well China's navigated this despite all the problems that they had last year. They had a ton. They have more, and they still have them. I mean, like we're still seeing housing fracturing. It's not clear that they can handle all that cleanly, but they're playing lender of last resort. It is pretty clear though that they don't want the U.S. dollar to completely collapse before they have an alternative to it. Really,
not yet.
Right. Well, the thing is, they have to completely change their economic strategy to be us. Because one of the things that you have to be as a consumer of last resort for your currency to be super valuable, because people are going to want it to like sell you shit. Like it's a cycle of selling American shit. That's why. So if they were to try to accelerate and become our version of the consumer currency, they would have to have an economy that looks like ours. And that would be disastrous for Chinese people, and the Chinese people wouldn't put up with it. Like for all the power of the state, like China, Chinese peasants revolt a lot, and there are still people with living memory of the proletarian revolution, although they're very old now. By that I mean the proletarian cultural revolution, and the mixing of classes that enabled. There's a younger, more meritocratic-oriented group that's probably in my age now that's interesting to see where they go. But I feel very weird talking about China in like this blanket way anyway, because like there are regional differences. There's all kinds of fractures. On one hand, they do have a massive demographic crisis coming, the likes of which we'd never seen because it's not happened to a society that massive. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it's not any different than the demographic crisis everybody else is going through. It's just you're a bigger fucking country. And so
even when Elon Musk is talking about something, and even he is like concerned about like this population decline.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's a wrong clock is right occasionally, but when even he is talking about it, it's like,
well, the thing is, it's also something we need. Like there's a challenge here. Yes, we have enough resources that everyone in the world could live comfortably off of current resources if they were allocated correctly. They are not allocated correctly.
Right.
So, and that's not changing today or tomorrow. So what's happening is a natural response to that. Like, I mean, in some ways it is interesting that like societal collapse is still possible, read Joseph Tainer, but there is a way in which there does seem to be a metabolic response of cost of living to child rearing that just leads to a much smaller population over time. Like, so we don't have overpopulation, we have temporary overcrowding. And what that means, though, is that the reset is ugly because you have a society that we built up all these resources for more people. And under capitalism, you have to grow, or everything immediately shrinks. Right? Like,
it's the same issue. I mean, when I hear certain arguments about AI, people want to ban it because it's going to create a economic crisis, and it's like that's not the technology's fault.
Yeah, and also
that's our economic system.
Yeah, we have a technology like under a different economic system. Like this would just all be good.
Yeah,
this would just reduce socially necessary labor time.
Right.
As long as we don't accidentally program the AIs to be expansive the way most beings are. Because I don't just think that's unique to humans. As long as it doesn't see life as a competition in it, it's just probably a good thing to have around. Like, even if it was to have significant agency, like it would be cool to have something as smart as us that we don't actually have to compete over the same kinds of resources for.
Yeah,
I
can help you do a sanity check,
right?
Once in a while.
It's just like, okay, I mean, it might actually, for example, talk us out of doing some of the dumb shit we do to ourselves. Like,
I've been messing around with just an application that's a very simple chatbot interface. And one of the modes that I have for when it calls to the OpenAI API, I have devil's advocate. So you want it to take the opposite position of whatever you're saying, and you can see if it's making a good argument. That's incredibly useful.
Yeah, it is. And I think and it's incredibly useful for like offloading bullshit coding and making sure your small shit's right. Like, and you can focus on the big shit. Like, it's sort of great in that regards. Like, I say this as a person who's also not as threatened by it, because of one of the things that it does is it's a very good mediocre writer. Right? Like, it's a very smart mediocre writer. But that's interestingly where its ability actually like why it's not really totally human really shows up, even though it can sound like it can pass the Turing test, but it's gonna pass the Turing test as a fairly uncreative individual.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's the same thing as like you make the composite of all people, of all the beautiful people. It's actually not as beautiful as a lot of the individual people in there because it's not that unique. But it's functional as fuck. Like, there's just all this smaller stuff you don't have to do. Well, we don't know if that's going to erode shit over time once it starts feeding itself back into itself. That's an interesting question. Like,
I've heard that concern before. I'm not so worried about that. When I've seen a few projects, people working on machine learning, training data, and using GPT-4 to create the data. Or it plays a role. It doesn't just contrive the data out of nothing, but it plays a role in formatting and organizing the training data in a way that if a human had to do it, it would take an ungodly amount of time. And we're seeing good results with that for the most part. We're not seeing like I think it is too early to say whether or not that problem is really going to come up at a certain point. But as of right now, I'm not too worried about it.
Well, there's still way more human production than there is ChatGPT production.
Right.
I mean, the only thing we've heard is Clark's World shutting down over ChatGPT generated shitty short stories, which I'm not even sure I totally believe. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm really.
It sounds like there's more to that.
Like, I was like, you got that many? Like as a poet, for example, it still can't do what I do. It can write a good poem, but it can't do what I do. And that's actually kind of interesting to me. Like, it's not that it could never. If it had enough of my work, it could probably figure out like
that's the thing. Yeah.
My patterns. But
imagine, a model that is trained on just your data.
Yeah, then you could replicate me, and that could be interesting. Yeah. I'm also not particularly worried about that. Like, I feel like, fuck, we've already lost this battle once the fucking chess game was lost, really. Like,
yeah, that's when it was over.
Like,
it was already over at that point. Yeah, I have concerns that it's going to create economic turmoil.
Absolutely. Although it's weird because it's only going to create economic turmoil in rent-seeking parts of the economy, but it's going to expose how much of our economy is now rent-seeking.
You don't think it can play a role in production?
Well, I absolutely do. But I don't think it plays a role that actually takes humans out of production.
But if it makes one person more efficient is the thing.
It's gonna what it's doing in that context, if it's not in a rent-seeking context, what it's doing is reducing socially necessary labor time, which sucks in capitalism.
It should be good.
It should be good. And I mean, like, yeah, I think, like, if there's anything that actually is going to trigger a final crisis, believe it or not, it would be something like this, because it could foreseeably reduce most socially necessary labor time down to very, very little.
You would just see a concerted fall in the price of everything.
Right. Or they're going to have to lock that shit down under IP, in which case you really are. Like, I make fun of the concept of techno-neo-feudalism, particularly when people were talking about it 2 years ago. But this really could lead to something like that, except
it wouldn't be sustainable.
It wouldn't be sustainable because it's not tied into something like real feudalism is about food. Like, it's about food and arms. It's about
crop yields.
It's about crop yields and weaponry. And it's the reason why it's low growth, and I'm going to sound like old Robert Brenner here, is because, like, it's not about exploitation. It's about extraction to court. Like, an extraction, interestingly, requires more and more to make extraction more efficient. You need more and more weapons, more and more guns, more and more army, etc. And that pretty much eats up your growth cost. Like your ability to grow is eaten up in in making the machines of war. Interestingly, machines of war in capitalism, because of the way you exploit workers, actually lowers costs. Because it makes pushing the workers' productivity the variable, one of the variable forms of capital and the easiest one to valorize. So that's what you do. But interestingly, I think it's interesting that if we note that since 2008, we've never returned to pre-2008 productivity levels.
Nope.
That's why I think neoliberalism is shifting to something else, and we don't know what it is. Like that's the rational core of the Great Reset bullshit. That there is something there, and it was happening before COVID. Like this QE stuff that we were doing was trying to like stall, basically. And in some degrees, like monetary schemes can help with this. I'm not totally anti-MMT and whatnot anymore, but I do think you have to look at this like this changes production in a fundamental way. And we are also seeing this at a time. The thing that's the elephant in the room is we're doubling down on nationalism at a time when all of the big societies, with the exception of maybe India, are all going to be declining in population pretty massively, where there's hundreds of people outside the, growing populations outside the gates that aren't declining. And they're the places hardest hit too. The idea that you're going to be able to keep those walls up strong is going to get very dark very quickly, or just collapse. And one of the reasons why I think these walls are up strong is there is a certain sense in which people are worried that no nation can handle this much instability that fast. Like, I don't think it's just xenophobia, although xenophobia is encouraged under these conditions, but I don't think it's just that. You have to train people. You have to get them on at least speaking the same language and whatnot. And you can do that through work, but you have to have enough work for them.
Yeah.
Now you see the problem. So that's to me, that's the actual. It's not whether or not the robot overlords are going to take us over, because I just don't think. I don't think unless this. My fear was always that this learning machine stuff with the rise in military tech first, and that is a disaster.
That is a very rational concern,
right?
I do.
I still sort of worry about that with DARPA, like that maybe they've already done it.
100%. Like, I really am curious because
that's the elephant in the room when everyone's talking about yeah.
I guarantee you there are CIA assets at OpenAI.
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, here's the thing I think about right now, though. Everyone's, people are like, well, the right's so much more armed to the left, and we could take out the government. I'm like, you dumb motherfuckers. Even if you had a third of the actual army, the part of the army that controls the machinery is not generally your part. That's generally, that can be filled in by anybody, and particularly now you have chatbots to do it.
Yep.
Your AR-15s don't do much against drones with cluster bombs.
Even if it did, they just send another one.
Like, you don't even need to be in good shape for that military to work. Like that, and that just has not really dawned on people about the implications of what happened in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. That we robotized that, motherfuckers. We already live in Skynet. Like, it's just run by people.
I just read a paper about GPT-4 being used to create commands for robots. And that sent my mind to some dark places. Everyone likes to think of the robot butler, but more likely than not, the military applications are going to be the thing that is developed first. No, it'll be porn first and then military.
Yeah, that tends to be the way it goes. Um,
But yeah, it's an interesting.
Yeah, I worry about that. I worry that we haven't even gotten like, hey, Axis Asimov told us what we need to put in here as fail safes, like for moment one, and even with that, it can get around it. But like, you better like just remember with these kinds of intelligences, until they have sentience, they're going to do exactly what you tell them to. Like, they are very much like an accidentally evil genie. Because they do exactly what you tell them to do, like whether or not you understand all the implications of what you just said or not.
Yeah, it's a monkey's paw type situation.
And that shit we should be concerned with. I mean, I think legitimately we should be concerned with. I think what's interesting is like it also increases this whole problem that we're seeing in like in Syria and Ukraine and whatever, where you have these proxy wars, but they really can't. No one. I have people who yell at me and like, Russia's gonna win or the NATO's gonna win. Mostly it's Russia's gonna win because I think people are surprised I'm not on that train. I'm also not on the NATO train either. And I'm just like, I don't think so, because the existential risk for actually escalating to the point where you could win totally risk total annihilation for both sides, and that has not changed, motherfuckers. That hasn't changed at all.
I'm on the train of this is going to be a long ordeal with a lot of suffering involved, and it's not going to be good for anybody.
Yeah, and it's going to drive a lot of the left completely batty. And also, I mean, people don't like my geopolitics on this, but I'm sorry, I think I'm correct. We're seeing a lot of bad intentions, but also a lot of unintentions really come forward in ways that are very hard to disentangle. And the country that seems to be trying to disentangle it the fastest, and thus is why I call them the most responsible one, is China. And even they're getting stuck in shit. Like, the Belt and Road Initiative is still stalled, even though they're really doing good on reaching out to the Middle East, becoming a lender of last resort, running a slightly inflationary monetary policy to compensate for that. They're doing a lot of the things that is pretty smart to do, but they're still running into serious problems because the system is more complicated than any one nation can deal with. Which is also why we kind of like the United States wants to bully everyone around, but doesn't really want to run it anymore either. Like, what do I mean by that? We clearly still want to run it because we're still trying to bully everyone around. But there's a fundamental issue where we're pulling back and we're just hoping that if we tell people what to do, they'll continue running their part of it. It's part of why multipolarity is like inevitable. But people who like celebrate it or bemoan it or cry about it, it's like, I don't see why. Like, to me, it's like a thing. The conditions there are almost infinitely complex. None of us know what it means, and we should quit pretending we know what it means. And also, when it comes to these proxy wars, we should quit pretending that any side can clearly win, because so far in the 21st century, we don't have any evidence for that after Chechnya, actually. Like, we don't have a single war where there's a clear one-sided winner anymore. I can't think of one. Like, so, and that's because everyone's fighting handicap because the capacity to kill everyone exists. And you start adding in these AI robots to that, like, no, it's going to make, I mean, ironically, it probably will make war just less and less likely because the risk just becomes existentially too high and no one really wants to pull that trigger.
I do tend to think, the conversation online, a lot of what I see entails discussion of AI as though it's a singular entity, but there's going to be a multiplicity of all different types of models that are being used for all sorts of things.
We already have several models, right? Like,
yeah. And the issue is one bad actor can cause a lot of chaos, but I don't think the response to that is to stop developing AI. I think the argument I've seen that is the most compelling is that the best way to stop bad AI is good AI. Maybe a little bit simplistic, but I think that's really the only answer, because banning this stuff isn't going to work. If you ban it, other countries are just going to develop it. If you try to create proprietary models, those are just going to be pirated and used for different purposes. The cat's out of the bag. It's not going back in.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is Aaron Benyev so far has been correct, though, that ChatGPT hasn't been chasing whole fields out of their jobs yet. But
it came out in November.
Oh, it did?
I mean, 3.5 came out in November. And 4 came out like a month ago. So it's very early.
My thing is that if it's going to be continued, it's going to be continued because it lowers socially necessary labor time, which, talking into bourgeois ways of talking about it, means it raises a nominal productivity per worker. Which I think in coding we can undeniably see. Like, I have coding friends who just told me, like, God, this outsources so much bullshit coding, and I can now do, and like, what used to take me 8 hours of just tedious grunt work, I can now just focus on the design and get it done, and for 4 or 5 hours, get a better design done, and then have the small code done by ChatGPT, and it's over.
I'm working on a Flask application, which Flask is a framework, a micro framework for Python. I hardly even know Python. And I've been able to work with it fairly easily. It's not perfect. It makes shit up. It'll come up with a function on the fly. And you have to be on the lookout for that. You have to be on the lookout for logical errors. And this was where things get a bit weird, but it's actually not making a logical error. It's producing the statistically the most likely response based on the data that it's been trained on. But whatever the most likely response is a logical error. So you have to be on the lookout for stuff like this, but even accounting for it, yeah, on the conservative end of things, I think it's increased my productivity like 3 times.
Well, we haven't seen a productivity gain in 15 years. So I mean, as far as capitalism is concerned, and honestly, as far as we're concerned, initially that's going to be a good thing. In the long term, it's going to be a bad thing under capitalist conditions.
Right.
The question is, and I think this is where my going all the way back to that inevitability of communism debate versus probabilistically, what if the probability is some option that we just never have imagined?
Yeah, I think about that.
Like, it's not communism or capitalism. It's not neo-feudalism either. It's some new social form.
But
that we didn't imagine.
Is that imaginable? I mean, like, because I tend to think those are the options, or common ruin.
Well, I mean, like, strange attractors fucking exist, right? Like,
what's that?
Strange attractor, like, so, and the one thing people will say, Colin Drum talks about this when people go, well, Hegel and Marx lived the complexity, and they're like, Hegel and Marx don't deal with strange attractors, which is unforeseens, non-inevitables, not just contingency, but like contingency that once it exists also changes all the other parts of the equation.
Like unknown unknowns.
Yeah, unknown unknowns that emerge from interactions that you don't see. The unforeseen, it's an unforeseen consequences multiplier.
Yeah.
All right. So that's what we call, in complexity theory, we call it a strange attractor. Like there's basic attractors. That's what you think of as like a teleological development. But then there's strange attractors, which are these unknown logical implications that cause a new thing to emerge and pull towards that too. So both you have the teleologically intended development and then this other development, because technology has teleos, right? Like evolution doesn't, but we do. In so much that when we make shit, we make it to do a thing that it is optimized for. But it may also do other things. So strange attractors really like you develop a drug and it has some side effect that's actually useful, and you start developing towards that side effect, and that changes the direction of the drug. Well, in complex systems, that can emerge in a complex way. Which means, because my point about like every now and then one of the things I've noticed that I've started playing with, that Platypus actually came up with, that's different from a lot of Marxist society, is separating bourgeois society from capitalist society. Like that capitalism is society we got, but bourgeois society was actually an attempt at something else, and then its immediate regression and the Bonapartism, etc., led to
bourgeois utopian is
right. Yeah. So if we think about the current scenario, in all likelihood, the attempt at communism altered capitalism in a way that something else may because of the way we've been playing with technology. One thing I want to point out, that most of the internet technologies are not, strictly speaking, logically capitalist technologies. They didn't really emerge in that context.
Yeah.
Like,
you could argue they're the opposite.
Yeah, they emerged in cybernetic context in competition with the Soviet Union, when certain capitalist rules were actually dropped to compete with the Soviet Union. Which means we could be dealing with unforeseen things. I'm not saying it's likely, but it's just a logical, it's when you talk about systems theory, it's a logical possibility we have to entertain to be intellectually responsible if we're still going to be socialist. That, like, holy shit, there may be something else that has emerged from all these tendencies interacting in this totality we call capitalism that no one could have predicted.
It's just hard to talk about because of the way
because no one's predicted it.
Yeah. Right. It's an unknown.
Right. But some of this
I think it might be helpful to just I think this is why it might be helpful to define socialism as almost like a floating signifier, or something.
You know what my orientation for communism is, right? Power egalitarianism in a classless society, and by classless, I do not mean like that there's no hierarchies, but that the hierarchies are truly provisional and meritocratic. Like, and professionalization, whether people realize it or not, is actually a check against meritocracy. So that's what I mean. Like, yeah, we might have leaders, we might have people with certain skills. If they get benefits from it, they need to be immediately recoverable, and you also shouldn't be able to accumulate a whole lot more based on it alone. So when people start talking about like value added, and I'm like, nope, that's not, like, that can't be part of socialism.
Right.
Like, but everything else, including shit like labor tokens or cybernetic theory or all that, how you build it, I'm like, our immediate political programs. I'm a big programmatic unity guy, but I'm also like, we can't make the program preemptively. You have to have the mass base before you can build the program. I'm sorry. Like, because that program's got to come up from the conditions and the people who are the subject of the program coming up with that program. We can't preempt it. That's like my primary disagreement with Neo-Kautsky. I'm with them all the way, except they think they already have a program. I'm like, you don't. You can't know. You can't have a perfectly planned out socialist society, or even a planned out way to get to it. You do not know. If you knew, you would have already done it, and we haven't.
I'm almost like naively optimistic that if you developed a sophisticated enough AI, it would just be a socialist.
Well, I mean, if you think about the conditions of primitive communism, you get rid of what the competition that made primitive communism so inefficient, and why it only really exists. I mean, there's an irony that people who study anthropology will point out, that like highly developed societies are more like early societies that are less developed, because the reasons for hierarchy just start to degrade, except in hierarchies of very specific skill sets.
Yeah.
But like
The important ones.
Yeah, but we don't think about like, we don't think that like, with the exception of the very rich, most people do not. And that's one of the problems with our current society, is like, it's so unequal. We don't even deal with the people who are at the top. Really, we don't really.
They might as well be aliens,
right? But most people you interact with are functionally your peers. So we live in we experience the world in a relatively power egalitarian way, even though we know, because we can see the evidence, that it's not that way all the time. Which actually is why we're more pissed off about it in a lot of ways too, because it's like,
it makes it worse.
It makes it worse. You feel it more. All that being said, that's my hope too. The other thing is, that's just becoming very clear to me that there is a decadency and degeneration to our ruling class, even under meritocratic conditions. The nepo, like the three generational thing, which is not something Marxists talk about, but I just see a lot of evidence for that. Like, okay, you have the people who establish it, you have the people who build off them, who actually are able to do more than the people who establish everything. But then their kids are going to be so protected and isolated, they do not have the same struggle to produce anything, and they degenerate, even though they're technically more educated and start from a higher point.
This is the entire point of the show Succession.
Yeah, it is actually. But I think a lot of Marxists are uncomfortable with that, because, you know, it implies. But I'm like, yeah, the bourgeoisie is a structure. But if you look at the families within the bourgeoisie, like you look at the richest families, well, the richest people right now are these tech entrepreneurs, but the richest families are all the old Fordist companies and their families who own them. Yeah. They're just out to lunch now. And their end is degenerative part of the cycle. The old rich Brahmin families that like started American capitalism, the old entrepreneurial families, they're largely no longer that important.
Mm-hmm.
So there are cycles in this. And it took a long time for people like Trump and Jimmy Carter, and to some degree LBJ, but like the 60s and 70s, from JFK to Reagan, you have a pushback on the ruling of the old Brahmin elite. Interestingly, from Reagan up into Obama, they kind of reasserted themselves. Like the Bushes are part of that old elite. Obama's actually related to them, like to that elite through his mom, which was fascinating. Like George W. Bush is a distant cousin of his. It's pretty funny.
That's hilarious.
But that's over. Like Trump, to a lesser degree, Biden, they don't come from that stock. They come from elites, but they don't come from the old guard. They don't. Like,
yeah. Let this get really uncomfortable when you start talking like this.
Yeah, they do, because they don't.
There's something to with the decadence, but we're not talking about it in moral terms here. They're just incompetent.
Yeah. Like that, when we complain about like the PMC, I've talked about the rational. I don't like the PMC thesis for a lot of reasons. One of which is like everybody who uses it both expands it horizontally and backwards in the time. like Catherine Lewis now got it all the way back to the 1890s, and I'm like. But the other thing is you have to deal with the fact that it's been splitting up itself since at least the beginning of neoliberalism, which Aaron Reich pointed out. If you think it was ever a coherent category, and I'm not sure I do, one of the things that happened with the PMC is a whole slew of jobs that used to be open to everybody due to just the overwhelming market competition for them had a credential Red Queen game going on. So it went from high school to associate's degree to to even up to graduate degrees for things that you used to just need a high school degree to do. So that when you factor that in, and also factor that in the generational patterns, like we talk about like the earning potential of degrees, and that's absolutely true in aggregate, but the richest generation has the least degrees. So you can't even talk about degrees off of wealth because the baby boomers have the fewest degrees. Like, they acquired wealth when it was easier to do off of the boom of the war.
It's just
like,
circumstantial.
It's circumstantial. So, but there is one element of it I think is true, that there is about 10% of the 40-something% of people that you call the PMC under the broadest definition who really do seem to run things. They are elites in the true sense. These are people that Peter Turchin and like Michael Lind worry about. They're very real, and they're not really capitalists. They're somewhere in between most of the time. They like probably make like half of their income off of stock options, but half of their income off of wage.
Yeah, they're playing both sides.
Right. But their interests are totally in the bourgeoisie, but also they're the actual people running a lot of this shit. That's true. Like the bourgeoisie, they make so much money, and they're so low investment yields in a lot of things. They're just like out doing speculative weird shit. Like, they don't need to engage in that. And they're engaging in conspiracist consumption. You know, like they're engaging in like competitive wealth consumption and competitive wealth consumption charity, even like
right around in yachts.
Yeah, but they're not producing in the same way anymore. Like, and they're not running things, and they're actually probably largely depolitical. That's the interesting thing. When I look at like how many of the big families are actively super political, it's a remarkably small amount of them. Like, you don't really hear much about like the Johnson family doing shit, or you know,
they don't
like,
need to be political.
They don't need to be, right? Like, it's actually like it's like the Sunbelt millionaires. It's like the middle tier of the 0.2%. This is the people who are really politically active, right? And at least from the evidence I see, and by the way, it's very hard to find this. You have to start correlating different stats that you can find in Fortune and statistics to kind of get a big picture of this, because the government doesn't really carry it, and like the people who do this kind of want this measured, but they don't want it measured totally out in the open. Like, you know, to be on the Forbes #1 biggest millionaires as an individual is like your nouveau riche, motherfucker.
Yeah.
You haven't figured out how to hide your wealth and divide it up yet.
It's gauche.
Yeah, it's gauche. Which is why they're all like tech billionaires, and they're all new. They really are new. Like, yeah, a lot of them came from relative money, but oh my God, are they richer than what they came from? But they're also declining pretty fast. Like,
yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens.
Zuckerberg lost like half his wealth in 2 years. Like, which tells me how much of that was truly fictitious. Like, it was unvalorizable.
Turns out when you try to run an entire industry on 0% interest rates, it doesn't work out well in the long run.
Or it works out fine until you actually have to do something.
Yeah.
Like,
you have to show results at some point.
Right. Like, as long as you're just trying to, like, you know, run an industry off of 0% interest rates and no one's actually really like looking at production, that's one thing. But one of the things I'd like to point out is the Fed really cared about two things. One, inflation bleeding out to the rest of the economy for whatever reason it did. And I think there's multiple reasons. That's my, like, I've gone through the different theories of inflation, and I think parts of all of them seem through right now, and none of them seem to be enough explanatory. Like, it's definitely not just labor costs. Labor costs is not the primary thing driving inflation. But it's actually a hyper complicated situation.
If I had to put my money on one thing, it would be supply constraints caused by the pandemic.
I would say supply constraints plus opportunistic price raises compared to those supply constraints as preparation for possible.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Inflation constraints, which may or may not occur, but you can reap a lot of profits in the interim. And then, I mean, there is a sense in which private debt is making up a lot of the difference right now. And that's not like, that's the opposite of what's supposed to happen according to the traditional Fed definition of what. But I guess that does. My thing is, they've learned accidentally from monetarism a way to discipline the labor market. And I don't even mean that with like, oh, they are trying to create unemployment, which they can't seem to be able to do. But they're also creating a lot of private debt, which means you're going to have to continue working.
And also just elevating the cost of housing, which was the main result of, the Fed's actions.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is but the cost of housing was also raising by other means. So what they have actually made it a little easier on renters indirectly.
Yeah, I don't think you could have said that a couple of years ago, but I think you have a point.
Right. So, I mean, I don't know. I am the other thing they've done is they've actually created a completely arbitrary wall of wealth. So anyone who got their locked in loans, they're now way wealthier than everybody else by just luck. Like, it's because it's not even investment. Like, yeah, people like, it's whether or not you did it at the right time, whether or not you had the money. And oh my God, if you bought a house cheaply, if you had the resources to not be in a subprime loan and bought a house cheaply in like 2010, you have probably quadrupled your investment, even under current conditions. And if you lock that fucking rate in, like if you refinanced, like this is smart stuff, but you don't normally expect to have a locked, because in the past when this happened, rates were not as locked as they are now. There's a lot more variable rate loans pre-2007.
Mm-hmm.
So that changes things pretty dramatically on like how this wealth gap plays out. And so you have basically created like a sub aristocracies within multiple social classes by doing this.
Yeah. I mean, that's mainly how I think of the boomers.
Yeah, but I mean, like,
some millennials too.
So just for example, I bought a house with my ex-wife. We divorced. I gave it to my ex-wife because I didn't want to make her sell the house, and neither one of us could afford off of what we would have made off of only owning a house for 2 years to buy another one. So I was like, yeah, I'll just that house in the year and a half after our divorce doubled in value.
Wow.
Which she wasn't trying to screw me. Like,
it's just what happened.
Yeah. It's what happened. She was even nice. She didn't have to do this. She gave me my deposit. She gave me my part of the down payment back. Like, just to be, because she's like, well, I kind of feel bad about it. Here you go. And I'm like, yay, I can pay off some debt with this. Like, you know, but she also locked that shit down, right? Literally 2 months before everything went to pot. So she refinanced and locked it down at an even lower rate, and it's locked now, right? And like the house will probably devalue some, but as long as she stays in it, it's not going to devalue enough for her to lose everything that she gained. And that's just fucking luck. I'm not even like mad about it. It's just like, I mean, it sucks for me a little bit, but there's no way that we could have saw that coming, really. Nobody predicted the boom happening during COVID.
Right. It's very counterintuitive. And the main thing I'm worried about now is people who are buying at this point and saying, oh, well, I could just refinance when the Fed pivots and interest rates go down. Or
maybe. It's a big if, isn't it?
It's a big if. It's a big thing to gamble on.
Because we don't know that. I mean, there is maybe a world where it never goes down. We don't ever see those conditions again.
I'm kind of on that fence. I
don't know how likely I don't know how likely that world is, but it's a possibility. Like, particularly with a declining population, I think.
Yep.
Because there's going to be a lot of open housing stock soon, guys. There is. A lot of people are just going to die. Like, I hate to point out that if you live in a southern state right now, you're, and I see it in my family. Like, my family, they're all in the South still. And I'm going to be deeply personal. It's been hard for me, but like, they're dying 10 years younger than their parents on average. They're dying in their late 60s. Their parents died in their 70s and 80s. Now, where I live, people are still dying in their 80s. Like,
you're saying we have some kind of bifurcated life expectancy crisis.
We do. And it's no longer just it's always been racial, but one of the things that's happening is like poor white people in the South now have about the same their life expectancy is getting closer. Like, we're closing the racial life expectancy gap by lowering white people's life expectancy and slightly raising people of color's life expectancy. But it's a lot more going down than one's going up. Yeah. It's a very dark thing to think about. It is,
especially when you consider that a lot of that is suicides and overdoses.
Suicides, overdoses, drug addictions, alcoholism.
Yeah.
And complications of cancer from those things as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we've seen cancer rates go up. But the scariest thing, dude, is how much more young people are dying, people under 25. And it's mostly cars and suicide, but it's also heart attacks.
That's really frightening, especially when you look at my cholesterol.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like the stress levels, like people are dying from stress increases, or fragility, maybe both. I don't know. Like, I actually don't know. I thought it was just going to be, okay, it's COVID plus COVID doesn't affect young people as badly, but it'll be a little bit of a tip up, plus car wrecks, plus maybe complications of alcoholism, plus suicide, because suicide rates have gone up pretty dramatically. And then I was like, heart attacks? Heart attacks have gone up in people under 25? Like, millennials are dying of fucking Zoomers are dying of heart attacks?
That's
my
really
God.
Amazing.
Like,
I think some of that might be like for instance, I have ulcerative colitis. Not something you see outside of the developed world. It's a distinctly, it's a problem that occurs in developed nations, right? No one really knows why that is. Although obviously diet comes into it. And yeah, I'm on medication. I'm okay. But I gotta think that that medication is going to catch up with me at some point. Something about it. I'm on it's called Xeljanz. My doctor said they put an X, a J, and a Z in that medication because it played well in focus groups for some reason. But
that explains all the X names and medications that I don't understand.
Right.
All right.
Yeah. But anyway, it can cause it elevates the cholesterol. It can cause all sorts of problems. It can cause blood clots. It can cause a stroke. So I just assume by default, unless they develop something better, that's going to catch up with me at some point. I think a lot of the younger deaths that we're seeing are related to underlying conditions that would not exist if it weren't for our particular way of life.
Complicated by medicines that fix them in a way that causes other, I mean, look, my liver was being damaged by diabetes medication, of which I left the country, lost weight, and still, even though I gained some of the weight back during COVID, have not seen the return of the diabetes. Part of it's lifestyle change, but I've told people, like, I lost weight, and I had, like, I lost part of my stomach too. So, like, we're not gonna not point that out. So I want people to know. But I lost 100 pounds before that. Like just it's a 350-pound dude. I moved to Korea. I lost 100 pounds just by walking around every day because everything's designed to be walked, and by eating Korean food, which will give you, I mean, it'll give you stomach cancer. There's so much salt in it, and it'll raise your blood pressure, but it's
But that's
still
a
somehow
different
better
problem.
for you. It's a completely different problem. Like, you know, if it wasn't for alcohol, smoking, and stomach cancer, I think Koreans would be immortal. Like,
It's a peninsula mindset.
like, because you know, I mean, them and Japanese people lived in their 80s, like easily on average. But they, you know, they smoke more than we do, and the Koreans drink more than we do. Although American drinking patterns have radically changed, and I found this interesting. I've been researching to do a video on Werner Sombart, which is taking me a while because I'm trying to actually read primary and secondary sources for this. So just so you guys know, I can't make the 15-minute explainers every week, the ones that are like me explaining the historical school or whatever, because usually 15 minutes takes 24 hours of research. And Sombart's taking more. But anyway, Sombart pointed out that in the late 19th century, early 20th century, American workers, due to their justifiable belief, Sombart's where the all American workers think they're just embarrassed billionaires comes from. That's that quote. But people stop there and don't read why he says that they think that. He's like, look, the land policies make it realistic that proletarians can actually improve their lives there because of the cheap land, which means that they reinvest in shit. German, British, French proletariat do not have that out. So unless they get sucked into the imperial expansion, what are they going to do? Well, they drink themselves to death because there's, you know, very little else.
The Europeans do?
Yeah, in the beginning of the 20th century.
That tracks.
Right? We're outdoing European drinking patterns. We also see this increase in drinking in Britain, too.
Oh, I will drink any Brit under the table.
But that's not historically the case. Like even in times where we drunk more, like even when the scourge of alcohol hit the West, because it was the first time we could distill shit that safely, that strongly, right? In like the 1850s, we still had nothing like European drinking problems. And it was bad enough that tripped out the Temperance League and led to the temperance movement in the United States, right? Like, so, but Sombart just points out that it's because American proletarians, because of land policies, can legitimately believe in some kind of future until the land runs out, which it did. We just couldn't take anymore, like basically. So that's an interesting observation. I mean, you know, it's actually an interesting settler colonial observation, even.
Yeah.
So my point about that is like we no longer like we're seeing the kind of despair that you see in like 19th century, early 20th century European proletarians. What I'm saying.
The U.S. is undergoing Europeanization.
And our politics looks, I've been saying this for years. Everyone's like, I'm like, no, what's happening in the U.S. is the U.S. politics looks a lot more like Europe, and Europe's politics is a lot more like the U.S. We're kind of meeting in the middle somehow.
Trump is a European right-wing populist.
And I think that's an interesting thing which, you know, I guess makes some of the fascists. I tend to be with Danny Besner that I actually think calling everything fascist betrays a lack of imagination. Because I'm just like, yeah, some of the things rhyme with fascist. Some like for example, a lot of American policies inspired the fascist, the Nazi policies in specific. But there's also a whole different framework with Christianity and stuff that we don't have. Like, now we don't have Christianity, but that particular version of it. But in some ways, the difference just doesn't matter. Like I kind of have taken the Enzo Traverso like middle path on this, and let's just call it post-fascist, and because it doesn't really fit classical fascism, We don't really need to read all the horrors, because in some ways, like like the Southern Project is in some ways even worse than fascism. But there is a subtler colonial aspect of fascism. It definitely rhymes, and talking about proto and post fascism might be a better way to understand it, because we don't really have the mass base. We don't really have the war trauma. A lot of the people in that base are not actually traumatized by war. They have an imagined war trauma, but I don't really think that's the same thing. But I do think like we have a parafascist imaginary or something like that might be real.
And why is it worse? I think it's worse because fascism is just a country committing suicide.
Yeah, basically, it's the. I've always find it interesting that if you took the right opposition and the left opposition to fascism, I mean to the third period common term position, you actually, if you add them together, you got a correct understanding of fascism, which is like fascism is Bonapartism taken out to the entirety of the society. That's the right opposition's reading. The left opposition has an incoherent class base. This actually led Trotsky and like Bordiga and whatnot, which, you know, left communists and left opposition are starting the same thing, but they had a similar reading, to not think fascism was a very big threat because its incoherent class base couldn't be maintained. Where if you think about it as Bonapartism expanded to the whole society with an incoherent class base, you do see it is an attempt to restore balance to capital and to liberalism that is suicidal. But it does actually kind of work, like
it
in its destructiveness.
Yes, it has an incoherent class base, but that formula can cause a lot of damage.
Right. Exactly. It's hard to imagine a fascist society being around for very long, but it's easy. It's easy to imagine it like destroying half the planet.
That's why this post-fascism business is almost worse, because it's just a tendency that you can sort of inhabit when the opportunity arises.
And it's easier to fit on a modern worldview than, say, blood and soil, divine right of kings, or
it's more sustainable.
Confucian hierarchy of heaven or something like that. Like, it's just like, it's like, okay, so the ghost of fascism is in some ways, it leads to something new, but in some ways something dangerous. And in some ways, this is where the whole like accusations of red brown shit is somewhat real. People can't recognize it. Like, they don't, like, you could inhabit it and sound like a left winger, and inhabit it and sound like a right winger. Like, it's, which is actually interesting, because that's true of classical fascism too. Like, that's like the whole, like the thing that Marxists don't like to deal with, that liberals throw in our face, and they're not wrong about this, is that like over half of, particularly if you're not dealing in Germany, over half of the fascist leadership comes out of social democrats and communists. Like it's not their base. They don't have the same base. They don't come out of the base of the communist movement, but they're intellectuals. When they defect, that's where they go. They don't become liberals, usually. Trotsky has become neoconservative sometimes, and so do neo-Maoist, which is an interesting development. But what's interesting about that too is those groups never had a mass base, really.
Yeah.
And parafascism doesn't now either. Like, nobody thinks of themselves. Well, not nobody. Very few people think of themselves as an out-and-out fascist. There are groups that do, but they're kind of rare. But they're
outside of a few cranks,
right?
Not really.
I would say there are a lot more people think of themselves as out-and-out communists and out-and-out fascists at any given time. But there's a whole lot of tendencies that could have emerged that rhyme with it. I mean, I think that's true.
Yeah, I mean, the inverse is happening with the left, right? I think it's where whereas like fascism has sort of turned into this post-fascism, this nebulous tendency that can come up. The left gets more and more militant, but more and more impotent at the same time.
Because we don't have a mass base either, but we're not becoming an idea in which you can like. We're fracturing into different and opposed ideas, and ideas that inculcate militancy or at least alienation, which itself inculcates militancy. It's something that Freddie Perlman, former left communist, kind of popular in anarchist circles, but I think he's right about this. Like the alienation that people feel once they become leftists, because a lot of the heuristics that leftists give you to generate the world are actually antisocial, even though you're advocating for pro-social politics. And in that incoherence, all kinds of weird shit emerges. Tendency to start blurring the lines between systemic analysis and conspiracy, or blur the lines between personal accountability and systemic accountability. Like, so those are two different tendencies. One comes off the liberal end, and the other kind of comes off the more militant end. But we see both. The personal is the political on one hand, and then a total amorality, and politics has nothing to do with morality on the other. Like, these kinds of developments, and I don't think it's unique to us. I don't think it's unique to the left, but in this current moment, we have a critique, but we don't have an ideal. We don't know how to generate one either. Like most leftists, when you say classless society, don't even have a vision. They don't even have an orientation of what that means. For most people, left means, I don't know, government gives you stuff.
Government gives you stuff, progressive ideology.
Right. Which, to pick up from Christopher Lash's critique of what he called the politics of the ego or liberalism, is that's actually a self-abnegating political position. And it doesn't generate what you want it to. So, like, you want an administrative state that just kind of emerges and administrates itself, but it actually undermines the subject for that state to exist. Because the skill sets are inculcated by other things. And with the left, that it leaves us with like a class. Like, what's the first thing that happened when Bernie failed? Is all these old class politics that we hadn't heard got drug up from the 70s immediately. PMC. People started talking about monopoly capital like morons. They also blurred the line between Fordism and neoliberalism, which is interesting, because that's when I realized there actually is a connection between the two. It isn't the rupture that everyone thinks, because Fordism and Keynesian social democracy, as adopted in the 1960s in Europe, actually uses a lot of public-private partnerships that made neoliberalism easier to happen. Which is something that I don't think people realize, because and this was a tendency that started before Fordism. Like Bukharin's noticing it in like 1910 that the state is more and more involved. Now, we all know now from the empirical histories of the development of capitalism, the state was involved from moment one, but like the state became more and more involved at the end of the 19th and early 20th century to kind of mitigate the damages being done and to increase national competition for resources. And that became a huge tendency, which gets undone in Fordism and neoliberalism, but undone in a kind of very particular way, where in Fordism, it was like, okay, we're going to provide you social goods, but we're going to do it through your employer or through a welfare state that's powered by the employer's tax-based profitability, either one. But it's still tied to that employment and that capitalist productivity directly.
It's like and the ACA is basically like a Fordist solution.
Yeah, it's a Fordist solution without, and this is the difference between Fordist and neoliberalism. You kick labor off the chair; they don't have any say in it anymore. They're just subject to it. Like, so now you have markets and marketization, but labor has no push and say. And so, like, that's why a Fordist solution and a neoliberal solution, like when we talk about, is Biden doing neoliberalism and Fordism? I'm like, well, honestly, you can't really tell the difference all the time. It's who's going to have a seat at the table as a counterforce. Well, workers almost never do. So yes, it looks like neoliberal, but some of it's going to look a little bit more like Fordist industrial policy, because they're trying to reshore shit.
Trying to ramp up production in the U.S.
Right. We're trying to do what what Trump tried to say he could do off of political will, but now because we kind of have to, because the complexity of our supply lines and blue water lines or whatever is too much for anyone to maintain, and even to bring it back to our machines, the machines can't even figure out how to do it. Not really. Like, there's too many factors, which is an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah.
I mean,
one of these tendencies has to win out, and it has to happen soon, I feel like. Because you cannot ramp up production and have austerity at the same time.
Well, that's the thing. Like, that's what I've been pointing out. Like, you have this fundamental thing where you want to have austerity and discipline the labor class, but you also want to ramp up production and reshore.
You can't do both.
And you kind of have to do both, but you can't do both. So which one are you going to favor? And ultimately, yeah. I do think reshoring is going to win out, because otherwise, like, it's not going to matter if you get, like, okay, you crash the. My thing with the Fed, if they really, really wanted to get to fight inflation through raising unemployment, to do it with a declining employment base, you're going to have to destroy the economy, even for the.
You're not going to have a Fed if you do that.
Right. It's like, so what are you going to probably do? Well, you might have managed high interest rates for a very long time.
Yeah. That's kind of what I'm thinking.
As a way to increase class discipline, but you're not really going to engineer that unemployment. And it's going to mean that stocks are going to be a little bit more sluggish. It's going to slow growth, but that's going to actually encourage people to reinvest. You know, I bet the theory is that's going to encourage people to reinvest back into actual production.
Yeah. I hope they're right. Kind of.
It's kind of like a metabolic undoing of parts of neoliberalism, but only parts of it. Like it's a little bit of definancialization, a little bit of deglobalization, etc. And I think COVID just proved that, like, all this stuff is too complex. You can't see when anything happens now, you have cascade failure everywhere.
Yeah.
Like, which is something I always worry about communists, because they want to centralize everything, and I kind of get it, because that's theoretically more efficient, but they don't ever think about cascade failure. And I'm like, well, that's why the Soviet Union, like, fell really quickly. Like, it's like, yeah. like if you have a highly centralized system and a part of it breaks, it all breaks. Like, so yes, you have a highly efficient but super brittle system. So it's something I think a lot about when we talk about socialism. I'm like, can we talk about brittleness too? Like, because all I hear you guys talk about is efficiency, as if the other parts of physics don't exist. And this is literally a physics thing. Like this is about, I mean, I got in a debate with somebody about whether or not this is metaphorical. And then I was like, well, if it's metaphorical, like most everything is metaphorical, including most particle physics. But there is a real sense of, like, there's at least from the dynamics of speed and fragility is very real, even if it's like a model. So it's something I think we have to kind of deal with as we do. I don't know. I mean, the other thing is, the other irony about the current left is, unlike the current right, well, it's interesting, actually. Both the left and the right are more ideologically cohesive than they've probably been because of polarization. And both of them, I think, actually, and I would say correctly, feel like their politics is not represented, because we actually live at a time period where popular opinion doesn't really fucking matter.
Not at all.
Like, and that's why I can't get with people like, we just need to raise awareness. And I'm like, no, you don't. Like,
doesn't do anything.
It doesn't. We don't live in that moment anymore. We're not in a moment of mass politics because popular opinion's kind of been neutralized.
Like, look at the popular opinion being expressed in France.
Yeah.
Is it doing anything?
Unless they can take out the French military and not trigger like a global European civil war, no.
Good luck with that.
Like, so, I mean, that's the thing. a lot of my friends say, are we really at a point where like maybe power's gotten so centralized and so automated that it's irrelevant now? And I'm like, well, if your model for revolution is just, how do I say this? If your model for revolution is just the model of insurrectionary revolutions and the periphery are in the World War context of China and Russia in the early 20th century, then yes, actually, that's not possible right now.
Yeah, I agree.
Play acting revolutionary defeatism isn't going to change that because they still have the fucking robots. Like, they don't even need the people. Like, that's the thing. And I think that's the horrifying thing, because it really, like, I'm not black pilled, but I do sort of think like we have to really think about what we mean by this kind of revolutionary or reform politics. And like, neither one of those things work in the same way anymore. Like, we have to have a completely different strategy, and I don't think as one person I could figure out what that is. But if there is a strategy, ironically, it seems to be in the fucking AI bots. And not because I believe in fully automated gay luxury space communism, because I think that's a joke. Like, and it's also become a joke that I think people played with, but they kind of realized the problems with. But as you see people give up on that, one of the interesting things is like, there are certain podcasters that I sometimes work with that as they give up on that, they really don't talk about communist stuff hardly at all. Like,
that's the thing.
Like, it's more back to like constitutional ideal politics, which I'm not even against, but it's just like where they're at, because they've given up on.
It seems like there is just a collapse in the imaginative horizon of the left, and it's being expressed in all sorts of different ways. I do tend to think that, look, there's good reason to be skeptical of some of the claims being made in the artificial intelligence space. And there's different camps, there's different types of skeptics, so I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. But I do think some of this is just like neoliberal mindset, like this techno pessimism, this idea that we can't have good things because of course that couldn't be possible. I don't want to say I'm optimistic. I wouldn't call myself an accelerationist because there's all sorts of pitfalls there. But this is a space I'm really interested in, and I don't think the left is fully grasping the implications at this point. And I think part of the reason for that is just reflexive like perception of tech bros, right? Anything that tech bros invented couldn't be good, right? And there's an association with cryptocurrency, which is just totally.
It's unfortunate.
These two things are not analogous.
Because cryptocurrency actually doesn't even come from tech bros initially, really. It came from fucking gold buggers. Like, that's why I knew about it. Like, they had started that as a kind of alternative deflationary currency to gold. The problem with cryptocurrency is, one, it's kind of useless, and two, it's hyper deflationary. So you can only use it as like a pseudo investment mechanism. But if everyone realizes that it's only being held up by the belief that it's an investment mechanism, it falls apart immediately.
Its only true utility is as a currency on a black market, and that's a utility.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's not nothing, but when we talk about artificial intelligence, the utility, that this is a whole other ballpark, guys. This is.
Yeah, I think the cultural. I mean, one of the things that happened when our belief in tech bros is we were too optimistic during the last heyday of like the singularity talk at the end of the aughts, and that's when, like, this is where these cultural trends and leftism are interesting to me, because if you look back to the discourse around the Gen X left and the beginnings of the millennial left, when it starts to come of age at the end of the first period of the Iraq War, because the Iraq War lasted for fucking ever. um, um, you start to see a split between primitivism and hyper techno optimism.
Yep.
Peak oil, but a very like naive doomer. Like we've hit peak oil, guys, actually already. It just doesn't mean what you think it means. Basically, we are now putting almost as much energy into getting oil out so that we don't have to put all the energy into redoing all of our infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. But you
It's
see
not
the investment is starting
right,
to happen in
right.
renewables.
And you're seeing it being forced in certain places. And, you know, I have some friends who's like, why do the Europeans believe in renewables? And I'm like, some of it's stupid. I mean, like, for example, today, as we're talking, Germany decides to go ahead and close its last 3 nuclear plants, which I'm maybe even for in the long run, but in the immediate run, that's fucking dumb.
Yeah.
It's going to make them more dependent on oil and gas in the interim. But one thing is actually happening is we actually are seeing green investment offsetting the potential crisis, at least in continental Europe. Where we're not seeing it is Great Britain.
Mm.
So, and do I think there's problems? But there's problems with all this tech. None of these techs are without trade-offs. None of them are 100% solutions. You're not going to have anything that's quite as efficient as burning the energy of millions of years taken from the ground and the sun.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's really hard to beat that kind of energy density. I'm sorry, but you might get closer than we think. Like,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I mean, like, I'm not a doomer either. I mean, I think people have a hard time understanding where I come from because, like you, I'm a skeptic. But anyway, I do think it's interesting. Right now, we don't even have like the same apocalyptic. Like the primitives have just become apocalypticists for the most part. Totally.
Yeah.
They don't even think there's a primitive future possible, and the optimists are just kind of like generic social democrats, and they're not even that optimistic anymore.
No.
Which I think is interesting. The one of the things that I said that was interesting about the shift from Occupy and the end of the Gen X, Zennial left into the current millennial left, and I'm using these generational terms just as time markers, people. It's not purely a generational distinction. Is that you went from like a quasi-utopian to the point of absurdity, like David Graeber's whole "the Occupy is the goal." I'm like, that's fucking dumb. One of my many strikes against David Graeber.
That utopianism was always a kind of a pessimism in disguise, I feel.
That's the thing about David Graeber is it's like I'm an anarchist, but I believe in like MMT, and I'm like, so you're not an anarchist,
Yeah? So you believe in a state theory,
right? Also, like, there was a regression in my mind in like radical anthropology from people who like tried to study in the 70s the material conditions that led to ancient cultures doing some things and try to figure out how to apply that now to just like, if we believe different, it could be different, which is to me an objectively a regressive condition, because we're not looking at, okay, but why do people believe differently, and why is it consistent in certain places? Like, no, not everyone who has these conditions ends up the same way, but only in certain conditions do these ideas become even like really viable.
let's call it what it is. It's this like it's ritualistic utterance, like philosophy, where if you say something, it's true. It's the Barney the dinosaur school of political philosophy.
And I used to argue with MMTers about this too, and they used to say, "Oh, it's just bad ideology." I'm like, "No, it's not. There's power relationships that this maintains. It's not just bad ideology. Like it's not just that people don't understand what money does. Is that they understand if they did all the things you want it to do, that it's going to weaken their power, and you're not going to ever ask them to play nicely about that. And if you think that's true, you're an idiot. Yep. Like, yeah, one or two individuals will. Individuals class betray all the time. Like, because individuals have a lot more agency than groups. But in aggregate, it's pretty fucking predictable. I remember that back when I talked to Thaddeus Russell way back in the day. that was part of my philosophy that he hated. And I was like, individuals have a lot of agency, but aggregates don't. They're predictable. The like groups are both smarter and more predictable than individuals are.
Because he's like a hardcore individualist.
Right. And I'm just like, yeah, but in aggregate, like laws of numbers exist, motherfucker. And it is easier for me to predict what a group of people are going to do than it is for me to predict what one person's going to do. Mm-hmm. Like, just like it's easier to predict what a bunch of electrons are going to do, then good luck predicting what any one electron is going to do. It's literally impossible. Like, so there's that. There's a certain amount of, I'm not arguing that electrons have agency. There's just a certain amount of indeterminacy here. Which I guess we tie this back into our computing thing.
Yeah. Do you think there's like,
I'm wondering if we're going to get back into interesting, like, do you remember in the aughts where there's all this interest in biocomputing?
No, I think that missed me.
That was like, that was this field of research that largely seems to have been abandoned about like modeling computing off of evolution, but even not just in like, getting intelligence to emerge by running simulations that eat each other, but also like literally using proteins instead of silicon to build computers.
I've heard this vaguely alluded to.
I don't know how far they got. I wonder if that's going to be picked back up with this kind of. Like, I am wondering what's going to change, because the one thing I can say is I actually agree with Tyler Cohen, except for this machine learning stuff. All the low hanging fruit's been picked. Right? We don't have easy, like, that's why, like, people like, oh, technology's so much better. I'm like, if you think about the technology changes between the 10s and the 50s, no, we have not actually paced that way. Like, my God,
aside from the fact that if you had told me even just 5 years ago that we had a computer that passed the Turing test, I would say that's nuts.
Well, here's the thing. We've only had innovations in basically one field. Mm-hmm. And that's communications and coding. Right? Like, and this is where I do get all, Dwayne Monroe on you, and like there are real limitations to that in power production and whatever. And I think Dwayne's apt about that. But I do wonder if this actually finally opens this up back to other innovations and other kinds of things.
Definitely.
I mean, we already talk about, like, we're not thinking about this when combined with, say, CRISPR.
Yeah. But that goes both ways, right?
Right. Well, I mean, like, then you really do have a feedback loop. Like, and then that, like, my thing is, like, this is why the fight for this is really important. Like, like, because who's in control of this is going to, like, really matter if we even stay one species or not. Like,
we need to think really hard about how possible is it to run these things locally? How sophisticated can they be?
What are their real power inputs to run them locally? Like, for real, if you don't
outsource
it to, by that I mean don't outsource it to the internet.
Right.
Like, yeah, that's where it's pulling a lot of its information, but it's also where it's pulling a lot of its power. What if you are just running it natively? What does it do? Like,
this is the question a lot of interesting people are asking right now. I am keeping up with Hacker News. Someone made the claim that they're running Llama on a machine with 6 gigs of RAM.
That's insane.
Nothing.
Oh my God, that can run that on like a calculator.
Don't get me wrong, it's not fast, but the fact that it can do it at all possible.
What that implies is it knows how to pace itself to its power constraint.
Well, there's a lot of work being done with model compression and things along those lines. I read a paper about sparse GPT where their findings were basically that you could compress the model significantly with minimal loss in accuracy of what it's saying. So this is the type of stuff I'm paying attention to, because it has implications. If this was just a company with a really sophisticated AI, that would be one thing. It's another thing entirely
When this is like
when,
semi-open source at this point.
yeah,
Oh my god.
exactly.
Yeah,
And
I can't. I was, just so you know, I was a poo-pooer 3 weeks ago.
a lot is changing very quickly.
And now I'm sort of like, I still think we're being oversold this, but somehow I think we're being oversold and undersold simultaneously.
I feel
If
the
that
same
makes
way.
if that
I
makes
feel like
sense.
certain aspects of this that are being oversold, and then the other aspects that no one is talking about, like that you could possibly run this thing on your computer without access to the internet. Do you know, like, do people understand the implication of that?
Yeah, that's a big deal. Holy
We
shit,
should be
it's a big
thinking
deal.
long and we should be thinking long and hard about
That also implies we're not
how
going
to
to have
use this.
one singular AI chatbot. That just implies that there's like an infinite number of them, and you could feed it whatever you wanted.
There's a multitude of models. We need to start thinking about, and training them is not that expensive anymore. Or at least like training finely tuned versions of pre-existing models is not that expensive. There's that paper from, I think it was Stanford, where they spent $600 training a model that they're calling Alpaca, which is based on the Llama model from Meta. And their findings are it's pretty much just as good as GPT-3. So it's not great. It's not as good as GPT-4, but this is all happening within a few months. So I don't that's the reason why I'm excited about it, is I just check these papers every once in a while, and it seems like every single day something crazy is happening. And I do just want to emphasize, these like local models, they're not as good as what you'll see on. They're not as good as ChatGPT.
Yeah.
But the fact that in principle this is something that is an avenue worth it's an avenue worth exploring, and I think more leftists need to be paying attention to it. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about how the technology works. I think people are getting sidetracked with matters of copyright and plagiarism, which are just frankly not, from the standpoint of my just wanting the world to be a better place. I'm not terribly concerned about. I'm way more concerned about an economic crisis and also the potential for curing diseases and things along those lines. There's a lot of moralism going on right now that I think is misplaced.
So there's a lot of moralism that's about ownership that I think I understand from the standpoint of like artisans who are being devalued. You know, I say this as a poet. We don't have any fucking value anyway. But and I get that, and I understand that, and I understand that particularly with art, I get it.
But it's accelerating something that was already happening.
Right, and it's also, if it was happening under different constraints, and if the copyright constraints were fair, this would be an avenue for like crazy innovation in art.
Yeah,
like because you have an infinite collaborator. Like, you know, people aren't using it like that right now. I mean, but and so yeah, the art's generic, and I get it, and I get like supporting artists, and I'm not gonna shame any small, you know, like RPG companies. Like, okay, we're not gonna use AI, or we're gonna continue supporting artists. I'm like, you know, good on you. That's a ethical constraint that I appreciate.
You might be able to carve out a niche.
Yeah,
with
because you're already in a niche market, right? Like,
right.
Um, and I think that's fair, but you're not going to stop this in general.
No.
Um,
Think about how cool video games are going to be.
I say this as a person who literally likes one video game, but
What video game?
I like Diablos. That's
Okay.
really it. That's like it. Like, I even like the bad ones, like Immortal and 3, but like, nonetheless, it's an interesting thing for me because I have come over to video games are an interesting form of artistic expression. Actually,
They are.
I'm just not into them. Like,
yeah, that's fair.
I'm just old. Like my video games are like Mega Man and games that are generally fucking impossible to beat and weren't really about skill. I got skilled at those games.
It's like brute force. Yeah,
it's just like brute force memorization is what it was. Yeah. I mean, like, it's like really hard to be good at Mario until you learn exactly how to be good at Mario and then you can beat it in 15 minutes.
Yep.
Like, that was my video game world because that's what I didn't have the money to even have a system like that till I was in my teens, but in general that was what was available around me. You find the person who had a fucking Nintendo or a Sega and you go to their house and that's what we played. That's my world, one of the interesting, fascinating things for me is the actually technical degeneration of cell phone games. Because they actually get shittier and shittier. Like,
they do.
It's like, I'm like, the shit that came out for an iPhone like in 2010 is actually usually somewhat better than the stuff that comes out now.
I think the companies had a lot more capital to work with at that point.
I think you're right, actually. And I think now most things are just quick rink grabs for the most part.
Yep.
That are also like fine-tuned to be boring dopamine machines, which you can do with just flashing colors and mathematical feedback, really.
If there is a real concern in the video game space, vis-a-vis AI, it's that these games are going to be so interesting and immersive that no one is going to want to live in the real world.
Well, maybe that's how we stop social collapse, is by just stopping society altogether.
Just everyone is, yeah.
Just like
Baudrillard was right.
Just, if that's true, then I take back all the shit I said about Baudrillard.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, every now and then I'm like, maybe these weirdo Heideggerians have a point. I don't know. Like, I don't know. Well, on that note, I think this is a good place to end up because I think we just have to think more thoroughly about this. I think if people have a little bit of like, hey, this is more interesting than you think, and then a little bit of like, what are the costs really? And also that genie's out of the box with this. That I think is what we're going to really have to think about. Like, you don't really understand the implications of this yet.
I know I don't. Does. Yeah.
I know, yeah. And I guarantee you our tech bro overlords do not.
No, and the goal should be to wrestle away this technology from them.
Yeah, which now we have the means to do, ironically. Like, yeah. It's like, hey, we could all this code hoarding you've been doing for forever, it don't matter no more. Like,
yeah.
All I have to do is some basic math, motherfuckers. Like, I'm not even sure I have to do that. Like,
I think the more tech savvy leftists, if you're listening, we need to start thinking about training an AI model that is based on the principles of Marxism. What does that entail?
So we need to feed it capital and then feed it industrial inputs. Like,
yeah. Feed it economic data and feed it capital.
And like, if one, we could maybe solve some fucking debates. like, okay, Marxologist, we're gonna run which of these actually work. Like
the most influential thinker on the left in the next 10 years could be an AI. Now, if you told me I said something like that like a year ago, I would say I've completely lost my mind and I should not be taken seriously.
yeah, I was like, so you sound like Nick Bostrom, but optimistic. For those of you who don't know, Nick Bostrom was the AI is the most dangerous thing that ever happened to humans guy from 13, 14 years ago.
He's also the simulation theory guy.
Yeah. He's a lot of things. He was like what I thought of as a crack philosopher. Like it was like, well, he's just playing around with the ideas that most of us should avoid. But I'm glad somebody's doing it, I guess. He's like Baudrillard, but rigorous.
Like Baudrillard, but like more analytical.
Yeah.
And not a leftist.
No, but arguably neither was Baudrillard.
Right.
Although it's really hard to say. What we can say is he
at least
a Marxist.
Came from that.
Yeah, he came out of that. Analytical left. There is like even pre like my thing is even pre analytical Marxism. Sorry, Ben. Cross myself. Fucking Jew crossing himself at the mention of analytical Marxism. That's funny. But even analytical Marxism is not really the beginnings of leftist analytical thought. It really is like Red Vienna school. Carnap and Otto Neurath and all that. And I do often hope, when people like Brandon and stuff, that maybe we can start to reconcile the boring ass analytic philosophy with the interesting continental stuff, because I would like the interesting continental stuff just to have slightly more rigor and a little bit less poetry. And I say this as a poet, but it's like, I think because I am a poet, I'm like, that's rhetoric. That's rhetoric. You're not saying as much as you think you are. Let's like back it up and draw it out and really lay it down. Because, whatever you're going to say about Hegel, he at least, like, they formalized shit. Like, they did. Like, there was an attempt at real formalization. The science of logic, the longer logic and the shorter logic would not have been possible without that. And that's all. I mean, Marx also does. I mean, Marx's last days are him trying to figure out how to make a new math.
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call him a continental writer.
No. I mean, he's not. He both is and is not a philosopher.
Yeah.
So, it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing to deal with. But Western Marxism and continental philosophy are like totally entwined, in so much that Western Marxism and continental philosophy mean anything at all, which I'm not always sure they do. But I think this computer stuff, like we need to get back into that. We need to think about these categories more thoroughly, because it feels like something's changing and we don't understand it. And I actually don't know what the horizons really are. Like, it doesn't really seem like Star Trek horizons, but it also, I don't know. I mean, the way that singularity was talked about was obviously ridiculous, right?
Right. But it's just a point beyond which you don't know what's going to happen. I think we're getting close to that.
Yeah, to me, that's like, it's the point of infinite complexity when you start getting into like everything's a fucking strange attractor. Like, you can't like the logic has now gone beyond anybody, which, even not just in computing, I think maybe in life we're reaching, like in other elements of life, we're reaching that point. And that's why pessimism is a natural response, because we don't know, and thus maybe assuming the worst is psychologically protective.
I think that's what Chrisman's doing.
Yeah.
At least when it comes to AI. When I hear him talk about that,
I mean, Chrisman's like a preacher.
Yeah, he's getting spiritual, which I'm not into, but go off, King. You know?
As a person who used to be, quote, spiritual, unquote, I guess there's a lot of things that people are susceptible to that since I started off with those assumptions that I'm just not.
Yeah.
Conservatism is one of them. Uh, really spiritual ways of approaching the world is another. Uh, uh, Trying to settle all Marxiological arguments purely by citing text and asserting from text is a third one, which I find weird to be a weird dogmatism that we see. My other favorite one is like when we argue about who's an orthodox Marxist. I'm like, no one should be. We're not a fucking belief structure. Like, not like that.
Yeah.
Like
that should be considered an oxymoron.
Right.
You know.
It's like, are you an orthodox Darwinist, aka someone who rejects Mendelian genetics because of heresy?
Yeah.
Like, right. Like, we only want our pure, direct from the vein Dartmouth. Come the fuck on. Like, I don't know. I get very Stephen Jay Gouldy about like research programs and political programs. And yes, I know that platypus people would be like, Marxism isn't a research program. I'm like, no, it's not even a political program. It's like a philosophy it's like a meta philosophy, basically, of how to generate a science. You know, and a science here and what we really should say is maybe a comprehensive logic to like translate Wissenschaft a little better. But it's, you know, it's kind of what we mean by science. But science in the same way like math is a science, but math really isn't a science. Like, I know people get mad at me, but I'm like, you're not really discovering eternal forms, dude. Maybe you are, but then we need to really change our assumptions about the universe. Like, because materialism is kind of hard to maintain if you think math is real in that way. Like, if it's like a abductive correspondence, that's a different thing. But if you think like, no, there's a one in the universe, it's like, okay.
Yeah, I think I'm in the abductive correspondence camp.
Yeah, I think there might be math concepts that don't correspond to anything just to make the logic work. But I think in general, math is deduced by removing all of the qualitative properties and just focusing on countability. And then what the implications of that are is kind of almost infinite, you know?
Right.
Well, not almost infinite. It is infinite, literally. Like, there's infinities, and then there's the shit that breaks your brain, like thinking about infinities within infinities and bigger infinities and smaller infinities, because there's like an infinity of infinities, and then
this is why I think this is related, but the idea that like LLMs are only doing statistical inference, they're not making causal arguments. How could they be? And so therefore correlation doesn't equal causation. So you're never going to get like a system that can make causal arguments based on like based on an LLM, because the whole thing works through statistical inference. And I'm kind of like the guy in the Matrix that's eating the steak and saying, you know, what difference does it make? I've tested GPT, and you know, I'm sure other people are doing this as well, but trying to see like how far it can go with logical argumentation, and it's pretty damn good at this point. I asked it a series of questions just about like different stakeholders in a company, and this person dies and they inherit, you know, their 3 kids inherit this. How many would you have to convince to do a buyout? That sort of thing. It's really impressive, and I understand that it's predicting the next token based on statistics, but it's making causal It's making like logically coherent arguments that are valid. So what is the difference? Why does it matter? You know? And I guess they would say, well, it matters because it's going to get things wrong every now and then. So do people, you know? So it seems to me like there's a lot of mysticism around this idea of a person that we need to do away with. I don't think it's helpful in this argument.
Yeah,
Am I making sense?
No, you're making perfect sense. I mean, I'm not you like I think my argument in the beginning still stands. Is I think we can call this maybe an intelligence, but it's not human. But that's not necessarily.
But why should that be the goal?
I was just like, that's not necessarily relevant.
Yeah, who
like,
cares?
Like, why would we want our greatest helpful ally to be us? Because we already exist, right? Like,
the only reason they started with neural networks as the model is because they know the brain can do a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, we know that works. We don't know why it works, but we know that it works.
But that doesn't need to be the end all be all. You don't have to model it perfectly after a human brain in order for it to do cool shit. You don't have to achieve AGI in order for this to have widespread implications with respect to the economy and politics and everything in between. So yeah, that's the drum I've been beating.
Yeah, that's a good way to talk about it. Well, thank you so much, Dave. This one's actually short enough that it'll go on the regular channel.
We got under 3 hours.
Yeah, it was no longer one of our 5-hour epics about everything and nothing.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on, and just make sure you were my first guest, actually, way back when we first went independent. You were you were the first person I had on the show. It was you. No, you were the second person, actually. I think Andy was the first person. It was technically for a different show, and then you were the second person, and then you were a guest almost exactly a year ago. But that was 5 hours long, so it could not be released to the podcast feed because that one episode would have eaten up a third of all my bandwidth. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a good discussion.
It was great.